Number 1. Pamela Rogers Turner, the teacher who couldn't stop even after getting caught. Pamela Rogers Turner was by every outward measure the kind of teacher that small American towns hold up as an example, a young, energetic, physically attractive woman who had chosen to dedicate her life to educating children in a rural Tennessee community. Someone who coached sports, engaged with students beyond the classroom, and appeared to embody the kind of wholesome dedication that parents hope to find in the people entrusted with their children's development and safety. She was born in 1972 and grew up in the American South, eventually earning her teaching credentials and landing a position at Centennial Elementary School in McEwen, Tennessee, a quiet town in Humphreys County where everybody knew everybody, where the school was a cornerstone of community life, and where a teacher's word and reputation carried enormous weight. Turner was in her early 30s when the crime that would destroy her career, her freedom, and her standing in that community first came to light, and the details that emerged during the investigation and subsequent legal proceedings would shock not only the residents of McEwen, but the entire nation, as the case became one of the most widely covered teacher-student abuse scandals in American television history, broadcast across CNN, NBC, Fox News, and countless other outlets that found in Turner's story a disturbing reflection of a growing and deeply troubling pattern in American schools. The victim was a 13-year-old boy, a student at the school where Turner worked, a child who by legal and developmental definition was completely incapable of consenting to sexual activity with an adult, regardless of whatever framing or rationalization Turner may have applied to the relationship in her own mind. And it is critical to understand from the very beginning of this account that what occurred between Turner and this child was not a romance, was not a relationship of equals, and was not something that the boy could have meaningfully chosen or refused given the profound power imbalance that existed between a grown woman in a position of institutional authority and a 7th-grade child still years away from the legal age of consent. The abuse began sometime in 2004 and continued over a period of months, with Turner engaging in repeated sexual contact with the boy, exploiting the trust that his family and the community had placed in her as an educator, and manipulating the emotional vulnerabilities that are inherent in early adolescence to maintain the relationship and prevent the child from disclosing what was happening. In small towns like McEwen, the social fabric is tight enough that unusual behavior rarely goes unnoticed for long, and it was ultimately the community's closeness that contributed to the unraveling of Turner's crimes, as whispers and observations eventually made their way to the ears of people who had the authority and the obligation to act. Investigators in Humphreys County began looking into Turner following reports that suggested an inappropriate relationship between the teacher and her young student, and once law enforcement became involved, the situation moved quickly toward formal charges. Turner was arrested in January 2005 and charged with sexual battery by an authority figure, a charge under Tennessee law that specifically addresses situations in which a person in a position of trust or authority over a minor engages in sexual contact with that minor. A statute designed precisely for cases like this one where the imbalance of power is a defining feature of the offense. The arrest sent immediate shockwaves through the McEwen community, where many residents struggled to reconcile the image of the teacher they thought they knew with the allegations being made against her, and the case quickly attracted national media attention as outlets began covering what would become one of a series of high-profile female teachers' sexual abuse cases that drew intense public scrutiny during the mid-2000s. Turner initially entered a guilty plea to the charges against her, and in March 2005, she was sentenced to 9 months in jail, a term that many legal observers and victim advocates criticized as remarkably lenient given the seriousness of the offense, the age of the victim, and profound breach of trust that the crime represented, but which reflected a pattern of judicial inconsistency in sentencing for female sex offenders that has been widely documented and debated in legal scholarship and public discourse. As part of her sentence, Turner was placed on the sex offender registry, stripped of her teaching license, and subjected to probationary conditions that were specifically designed to prevent any further contact with minors, conditions that were both legally binding and practically essential given what the court had already established about her conduct. She was released after serving her jail term, and the community and the legal system both operated under the assumption, perhaps naively, that the combination of public exposure, criminal conviction, sex offender registration, and the terms of her probation would be sufficient to deter any further criminal behavior. That assumption proved catastrophically wrong. Within a remarkably short period following her release, Turner began violating the terms of her probation in ways that were not only brazen, but that demonstrated a deeply unsettling disregard for the law, for her victim, and for the conditions that the court had imposed precisely to protect the child she had already harmed. Investigators monitoring her compliance with probation terms discovered that Turner had been sending sexually explicit videos of herself to the same victim, a boy who was still a minor and who was still legally protected by the very probation conditions she was violating, and the content of those communications left absolutely no ambiguity about her intentions or her continued fixation on the child. The discovery of these probation violations triggered a second round of legal proceedings that proved far more consequential than the first, and Turner found herself back before the court facing not only the consequences of her original offense, but the additional weight of having deliberately and repeatedly defied the orders of the court while under supervision. The judge who presided over her probation violation hearing was not inclined toward leniency a second time, and in 2006 Turner was sentenced to 8 years in prison, a term that more accurately reflected the gravity of her offenses and the demonstrated pattern of predatory behavior that her probation violations had confirmed. The sentencing drew significant media coverage, with legal analysts pointing to the case as an example of how the initial lenient sentence had failed to account for the genuine danger that Turner posed to her victim and potentially to other children, and victim advocates used the case to highlight the ongoing problem of inadequate sentencing in cases involving female sex offenders, arguing that the legal system's tendency to treat female perpetrators more leniently than male perpetrators in equivalent circumstances represented a fundamental failure of equal justice. Turner entered the Tennessee Department of Correction to begin serving her 8-year sentence, and the case became a touchstone in national discussions about teacher-student boundaries, the sexual abuse of male minors by female authority figures, and the psychological impact of such abuse on young victims, who for decades have been systematically underserved by a cultural narrative that minimized or even glorified sexual contact between older women and young boys. The psychological literature on male victims of female sexual predators makes clear that the harm caused by such abuse is real, lasting, and in many ways compounded by the cultural tendency to dismiss or trivialize it, with research consistently showing that male victims of female perpetrators suffer significant psychological consequences, including depression, anxiety, difficulties with trust and intimate relationships, and in some cases post-traumatic stress disorder, outcomes that are strikingly similar to those documented in female victims of male perpetrators, despite the cultural myths that suggest otherwise. The victim in Turner's case had his adolescence fundamentally altered by what she did to him, his formative years shadowed by an experience that no child should ever have to navigate, and the ongoing nature of her contact even after her initial conviction suggests that Turner's behavior represented not an isolated lapse in judgment, but a sustained pattern of predatory conduct that the legal system was ultimately, if belatedly, forced to address with the seriousness it deserved. Turner served a significant portion of her 8-year sentence before becoming eligible for release considerations, and her time in prison did little to rehabilitate her public image or resolve the questions that her case had raised about the adequacy of the legal and institutional systems designed to protect children from adults in positions of authority over them. The Pamela Rogers Turner case remains one of the most extensively documented and widely discussed teacher sexual abuse cases in American legal history, cited regularly in discussions of sex offender policy, sentencing disparity, and the protection of minor victims. And it stands as a sobering reminder that the danger posed by predatory adults does not always conform to the gender assumptions that have historically shaped both public perception and judicial response. The school system in Humphreys County, like school systems across the country that have faced similar scandals, was forced to examine its own policies and procedures in the wake of the Turner case, asking difficult questions about what warning signs may have been present and overlooked, what safeguards had failed to prevent a teacher from gaining the kind of unsupervised access to a vulnerable child that allowed the abuse to occur and continue, and what systemic changes were necessary to reduce the likelihood of similar cases in the future. Those questions do not have easy answers, and the history of teacher sexual abuse cases in the United States suggests that institutional responses have frequently been inadequate, characterized by a tendency to prioritize the reputation of the school or district over the safety and well-being of students, to handle complaints internally rather than involving law enforcement, and to allow accused teachers to quietly resign and moved to other districts rather than facing the full consequences of their actions. Turner's case was unusual in that it did eventually result in meaningful legal consequences, even if the path to those consequences was longer and more complicated than it should have been. And in that sense, it represents a partial, imperfect example of the legal system functioning as it is supposed to function when children are victimized by the adults entrusted with their care and education. The broader legacy of the case is one of ongoing vigilance, of the recognition that predatory behavior does not announce itself in advance, that it can hide behind attractive appearances and community standing and professional dedication, and that the protection of children requires not only strong laws but consistent enforcement, genuine accountability, and a cultural willingness to take the victimization of boys as seriously as the victimization of girls, a standard that American society is. Still, decades after cases like Turner's first made headlines, working imperfectly and incompletely to meet. Number 2, Mary Kay Letourneau, the teacher who called it love while the law called it rape. Mary Kay Letourneau was born on January 30th, 1962, in South Dakota, the daughter of John Schmitz, a conservative Republican congressman and staunch Catholic who built his political career on a platform of traditional family values and moral rectitude, a biographical detail that would later strike many observers as deeply ironic given the nature of the scandal that would consume his daughter's life and make her name one of the most recognizable in the annals of American true crime. She grew up in a large, deeply religious household, one of 6 children raised in an environment where faith and family were central organizing principles, and she carried those values with her as she moved through adolescence and into adulthood, eventually marrying Steve Letourneau, a fellow student she had met in college, and building what appeared from the outside to be a conventional, stable family life in the suburbs of Seattle, Washington. By the early 1990s, Mary Kay Letourneau was a second-grade teacher at Shorewood Elementary School in the Burien area of Seattle, a position she held with apparent dedication and enthusiasm, known among colleagues and parents as a creative and engaged educator who genuinely connected with her young students and who brought an unusual level of energy and personal investment to her work in the classroom. She and Steve had 4 children together, and the family lived in a comfortable home in the Seattle suburbs, presenting to the world the image of a stable, middle-class American family navigating the ordinary challenges of work and parenthood and community life. Beneath that surface, however, the marriage was troubled, marked by financial stress, emotional distance, and the accumulated strains of a relationship that had perhaps never been as solid as it appeared, and was against this backdrop of personal dissatisfaction and domestic tension that Mary Kay Letourneau first encountered a child who would become the center of the most devastating and consequential chapter of her life. Willie Foileau was a student in her second-grade class when they first met, a boy from a Samoan American family who lived in the same general community and who stood out to his teacher as unusually creative, artistically gifted, and emotionally mature for his age, qualities that Letourneau would later cite in the narrative she constructed around their relationship, a narrative that placed enormous and deeply inappropriate emphasis on the child's perceived sophistication as a way of blurring the fundamental reality of what he was, which was a child, years away from a legal and developmental capacity to consent to a sexual relationship with an adult woman who occupied a position of authority and trust over him. Over the years that followed that initial classroom encounter, Letourneau maintained contact with Foileau as he progressed through the school system, and the relationship that developed between them, whatever its emotional character or subjective meaning to either party, crossed the legal and ethical boundaries that exist to protect children from exactly this kind of exploitation long before it became physically sexual. By the time Foileau was 12 years old and in the 6th grade, Letourneau had developed what she described as a profound emotional and artistic connection with him, a framing that she would return to repeatedly in the years that followed as she attempted to contextualize and justify conduct that the law, the professional ethics of her field, and the basic moral consensus of her community regarded as straightforwardly criminal. The sexual abuse began in 1996, when Foileau was 12 years old, a fact that bears repeating in emphasis because the age of the victim is not a peripheral detail, but the central reality of the case, the fact that makes everything else that happened a crime rather than a complicated human story, the fact that Letourneau's own subsequent narrative persistently worked to minimize or reframe, but that the legal system was ultimately obligated to treat with the seriousness and gravity it deserved. Letourneau was 34 years old when the abuse began, a grown woman, a married mother for a credentialed professional educator, and a person who by any reasonable measure possessed the life experience, the legal knowledge, and the basic moral understanding necessary to recognize that what she was doing was wrong, harmful, and criminal, regardless of whatever feelings she may have had, or whatever story she told herself about the nature of the relationship. The abuse continued over a period of months, and it was not discovered through any institutional mechanism or professional oversight, but rather through the kind of community-level disclosure that occurs when secrets become too large to contain, with Foileau eventually telling a friend about the relationship, and that information making its way to adults who reported it to the appropriate authorities. Letourneau was confronted by her husband, Steve, after he discovered evidence of the relationship, and the subsequent involvement of law enforcement moved the situation rapidly toward formal criminal proceedings. She was arrested in early 1997 and charged with 2 counts of second-degree child rape under Washington state law, charges that carried substantial potential prison time and that reflected the serious view that the state took of sexual contact between adults and children below the age of consent, which in Washington is set at 16 years old, meaning that Foileau, at 12, was 4 years below even that threshold and entirely outside any legal framework that could have construed what occurred between them as anything other than criminal abuse. The case attracted immediate and intense national media attention, in part because of the striking incongruity between Letourneau's appearance and background and the nature of the charges against her, in part because of the unusual dynamic of a female teacher abusing a male student, and in part because of the emotional and narrative complexity that Letourneau herself introduced into the public discourse through her insistence on framing the relationship as a genuine love story rather than acknowledging it as the predatory abuse it legally and ethically was. That framing would prove remarkably durable and remarkably damaging, shaping media coverage in ways that frequently prioritize the emotional drama of the situation over the fundamental fact of the victim's age and the criminal nature of the conduct, and contributing to a public conversation that was in many respects a failure of the media's responsibility to center the harm done to the child rather than the feelings of the adult perpetrator. What made the subsequent legal proceedings particularly remarkable and particularly consequential in terms of what they revealed about the systemic failures that can occur even within functioning legal institutions was the extraordinary leniency of the initial sentence that Letourneau received and the conditions under which that leniency was extended and then catastrophically violated. In November 1997, Letourneau pleaded guilty to 2 counts of child rape and was sentenced to 89 months, nearly 7.5 years in prison, but the sentencing judge, Judge Linda Lau, agreed to suspend all but 6 months of that sentence on the condition that Letourneau complete a sex offender treatment program and have absolutely no further contact with Willie Foileau, a condition that was both legally binding and, given what the court had already established about the nature and duration of the relationship, clearly essential to protection of the child. What the court did not know at the time of sentencing, and what would emerge a devastating effect in the months that followed, was that Letourneau was already pregnant with Foileau's child, a pregnancy that she had concealed from the court, and that would become the central fact of the probation violation that sent her back to prison for the full duration of her original sentence. She gave birth to a daughter, Audrey, in May 1998, while serving the initial 6-month jail term, and shortly after her release from that term, in what can only be described as a breathtaking disregard for court's explicit orders and the most fundamental obligations of her legal situation, she was discovered with Foileau in her car in a parking lot in the early morning hours of February 3rd, 1998, in direct violation of the no-contact order that was the central condition of her suspended sentence. The discovery left the court with no meaningful choice but to revoke the suspension and impose the full original sentence, and Judge Lau did exactly that, sending Letourneau to the Washington Correction Center for Women to serve the remaining 7.5 years of her sentence, a decision that was both legally correct and deeply necessary given the demonstrated pattern of behavior that the probation violation had confirmed. At the time of her reincarceration, Letourneau was again pregnant with Foileau's child, a second pregnancy that had occurred during the brief window between her initial release and her return to custody, and she gave birth to a second daughter, Georgia, while in prison, a set of circumstances that added layers of complexity and tragedy to an already deeply troubling situation, and that raised profound questions about the welfare of the children who were now caught up in the consequences of their mother's criminal conduct. Letourneau served her full sentence in the Washington state prison system, during which time she maintained her characterization of the relationship with Foileau as a genuine love story and resisted the therapeutic framework of the sex offender treatment programming that she was required to complete, a resistance that spoke to the depth of her inability or unwillingness to acknowledge the fundamental wrongness of what she had done to a child. She was released from prison in August 2004, having served a full 7.5-year sentence, and almost immediately after her release she reconnected with Foileau, who was by then an adult and legally free to make his own choices about the relationship, a circumstance that complicated the public and legal discourse around the case considerably, as the question of what a now-adult victim chooses to do with his life is genuinely distinct from the question of whether the original conduct was criminal and harmful. Letourneau and Foileau married in 2005, a ceremony that attracted enormous media attention, and that was covered by major outlets including Entertainment Tonight, which paid for exclusive rights to the wedding, a transaction that struck many victim advocates and child protection professionals as deeply troubling in its commercial treatment of a relationship that had originated in the criminal sexual abuse of a child. The marriage lasted for several years before the couple separated in 2017, and Foileau filed for legal separation, citing irreconcilable differences, an outcome that those who had followed the case with clinical rather than romantic eyes might have predicted given the deeply abnormal foundation on which the relationship had been built and the psychological literature on the long-term effects of childhood sexual abuse on relational functioning and emotional development. Mary Kay Letourneau was diagnosed with colon cancer in 2018, and she died on July 6, 2020, at the age of 58, at her home in the Seattle area, survived by her 6 children, including the 2 daughters she had with Foileau and the 4 children from her marriage to Steve Letourneau. The news of her death generated an extraordinary volume of media coverage that once again struggled with the tension between the human complexity of her story and the fundamental criminal reality of what she had done, with some outlets defaulting to the romantic framing that had characterized coverage of the case for decades, and others making more deliberate effort to center the harm done to Foileau and to resist the narrative of forbidden love that Letourneau herself had so persistently promoted. Villy Foileau gave an interview to a Seattle television station around the time of her death, in which he reflected on the relationship and its impact on his life in ways that were notably complicated and emotionally ambivalent, acknowledging both the genuine feelings he had developed and the ways in which the relationship had affected his development and his life trajectory, a testimony that illustrated with painful clarity the psychological complexity of the situation facing male victims of female sexual predators who are encouraged by cultural narratives to interpret their victimization as something other than what it legally and developmentally was. The Mary Kay Letourneau case occupies a unique and troubling place in the cultural history of teacher sexual abuse in America, not primarily because of the legal facts, which are in the most important respects straightforward, but because of the way in which the case was received and processed by media and public alike, with a persistent tendency to romanticize a criminal relationship in ways that minimize the harm to the child, undermine the seriousness with which society is obligated to treat the sexual abuse of minors, and contribute to a cultural environment in which the victimization of boys by women in authority continues to be inadequately recognized and inadequately addressed. The legal system, to its credit and despite the extraordinary leniency of the initial suspended sentence, ultimately imposed a meaningful consequence when Letourneau violated the terms of her probation, and the full 7.5-year sentence she served represented at least a partial acknowledgment of the gravity of the original offense, even if the path to that outcome was more complicated and contingent than it should have been. The children born the abuse, Audrey and Georgia Foileau, grew up in circumstances shaped entirely by their mother's criminal conduct and their father's victimization, and whatever the quality of their adult lives, they carry in their very existence the weight of a history that began with crime committed against a 12-year-old boy by a woman who knew better and chose not to care, a history that the American media spent years trying to transform into a love story, and that the legal record insists on preserving in its true and unromantic form as what it always fundamentally was, which is a sexual abuse of a child by an adult entrusted with his education and his welfare, a betrayal of trust as complete and as consequential as any that the institution of public education has ever been forced to confront. Number 3. Debra Lafave, the teacher whose looks became the centerpiece of a legal argument that outraged the nation. Debra Lafave was born on August 28, 1980, in Tampa, Florida, and by the time she entered the public consciousness in 2004 as the subject of one of the most controversial and widely debated teacher sexual abuse cases in American legal history. She had constructed for herself an outward life that seemed to embody the kind of conventional success and personal achievement that her Florida community admired and respected, a young woman who had survived genuine personal trauma in her adolescence, who had worked through those difficulties to earn a college degree and a teaching certificate, who had married a man named Alan Lafave in a ceremony that friends and family described as romantic and hopeful, and who had secured a position teaching reading to 7th and 8th graders at Angelo L. Greco Middle School in Temple Terrace, a suburb of Tampa, where she was regarded by colleagues and parents as an attractive, energetic, and apparently dedicated young educator who seemed genuinely invested in the students she taught and the community she served. The biography that Lafave presented to the world was one of resilience and normalcy, and nothing about her visible life in the spring of 2004 would have suggested to a casual observer that she was in the process of committing a series of criminal acts against a 14-year-old boy in her care that would within months destroy her marriage and her teaching career, land her in criminal court, and make her name synonymous in the American public mind with a particular kind of institutional betrayal and judicial controversy that continues to be debated in legal and advocacy circles to this day. The victim was a 14-year-old male student at Greco Middle School, a boy who was in the early years of his adolescence and who, like all children of his age, was legally and developmentally incapable of consenting to sexual activity with an adult, a fact that would become the central legal reality of the case even as the media coverage that surrounded it frequently and irresponsibly lost sight of that reality in favor of narratives that centered Lafave's appearance and the perceived reactions of the victim rather than the criminal nature of her conduct and the harm it caused. The abuse began in the spring of 2004 and involved multiple incidents of sexual contact between Lafave and the boy, occurring in various locations, including a classroom at the school, a vehicle belonging to the victim's cousin, and the home of the cousin in Marion County, Florida, a geographic spread that indicated not a single impulsive act, but a sustained pattern of deliberate criminal behavior carried out over a period of weeks, behavior that required planning, opportunity-seeking, and the kind of sustained grooming and manipulation of a minor that child protection professionals recognize as characteristic of predatory conduct, rather than spontaneous emotional failing. The investigation into Lafave's conduct began after the victim disclosed a relationship to his mother, a disclosure that represented both enormous courage on the part of a young teenager navigating an extraordinarily complicated and emotionally fraught situation, and the kind of outcome that child safety professionals hope for when they emphasize the importance of creating environments in which children feel safe and supported enough to come forward with disclosures of abuse by authority figures. The boy's mother contacted law enforcement, and the Hillsborough County Sheriff's Office and the Temple Terrace Police Department launched an investigation that moved quickly once the initial disclosure was made, gathering physical evidence, interviewing witnesses, and building a case that prosecutors believed was more than sufficient to support serious criminal charges against the teacher. Lafave was arrested in June 2004 and charged with 2 counts of lewd and lascivious battery, a felony under Florida law that carries substantial potential prison time and that applies specifically to sexual conduct with minors between the ages of 12 and 15. And the charges reflected the serious view that Florida prosecutors took of the case and their stated intention to pursue a conviction and a sentence that will hold Lafave fully accountable for what she had done to her student. The arrest generated immediate and extraordinary national media attention, driven in significant part by Lafave's physical appearance, which the media treated in ways that were simultaneously relevant to the legal facts of the case and deeply revealing about the cultural biases that shape public and journalistic responses to female sex offenders, with coverage frequently emphasizing her looks in ways that subtly or not so subtly suggested that her attractiveness was a mitigating factor, that the victim was lucky rather than harmed, and that the case occupied some ambiguous moral space that distinguished it from what would have been the unambiguous public condemnation that would have met equivalent conduct by a male teacher with a female student. That framing was wrong, it was harmful, and it was a disservice to the victim, and to every other male victim of female sexual predators whose experiences are minimized by exactly the kind of cultural messaging that the media coverage of the Lafave case both reflected and reinforced, and the legal and advocacy community's response to that coverage was sharp and sustained, with organizations dedicated to child protection and victim advocacy, making the Lafave case a focal point for criticism of the media's handling of female perpetrator cases and the systemic biases that such handling both expressed and perpetuated. The legal proceedings that followed Lafave's arrest were complicated from the outset by the position taken by the victim's family, specifically the boy's mother, who expressed concerns about the impact that a full trial and the attendant publicity would have on her son, a concern that is entirely understandable and entirely legitimate given the very real and well-documented secondary trauma that victims of sexual abuse can experience when required to testify publicly about their victimization before a court and a media audience. And that reflects a genuine tension that exists in the legal system between the state's interest in full accountability and prosecution and the victim's interest in protection from further harm. Prosecutors in Hillsborough County initially pursued the case vigorously, but the Marion County charges, which covered the incidents that had occurred at the cousin's home in that jurisdiction, became the subject of a separate plea negotiation that produced an outcome that generated enormous controversy and that became in many respects a defining legal moment of the case. In November 2005, Lafave entered into a plea agreement in Marion County under which she avoided prison time entirely, receiving instead a sentence of 3 years of house arrest followed by 7 years of probation, a sentence that her defense attorney John Fitzgibbons publicly characterized by arguing that Lafave was too attractive to survive prison, a statement that was so breathtaking in its implication that physical attractiveness constitutes a legally relevant mitigating factor in the sentencing of a convicted child sex offender that it drew immediate and widespread condemnation from legal scholars, victim advocates, and members of the public who recognized in it a naked expression of the gender double standard that had pervaded the entire handling of the case. The Hillsborough County case, which covered the incidents at the school and in the vehicle, was subsequently dropped by prosecutors on the grounds that proceeding to trial would cause further harm to the victim, a decision that the boy's mother had requested and that the prosecutor felt bound to honor given the victim's welfare, but that nonetheless left many observers deeply uncomfortable with the aggregate outcome of a series of criminal acts against a child resulting in no prison time whatsoever for the perpetrator. Lafave was placed on the sex offender registry, required to complete sex offender treatment, prohibited from having unsupervised contact with minors, and subjected to the terms of her house arrest and subsequent probation, conditions that represented at least some measure of consequence and ongoing supervision, even if they fell far short of the incarceration that advocates argued the seriousness of the offense demanded, and that an equivalent male perpetrator would almost certainly have received. The disparity between the outcome in the Lafave case and the outcomes that routinely result from equivalent offenses committed by male perpetrators became a central talking point in national discussions about sentencing equity in sex offense cases, with legal scholars and advocacy groups pointing to the case as a particularly stark example of the way in which gender, physical appearance, and cultural biases about male victimization combine within the legal system to produce outcomes that are inconsistent with the principle of equal justice under law, outcomes that send a damaging message to male victims about the seriousness with which their victimization will be treated, and that undermine the deterrent function of the criminal law by suggesting that female perpetrators can expect substantially reduced consequences for equivalent conduct. Lafave's marriage to Owen Lafave did not survive the scandal, with her husband filing for divorce shortly after her arrest, and the dissolution of the marriage was handled publicly enough that it added yet another layer of media narrative to a case that had from its inception been covered more like a celebrity scandal than a criminal prosecution, with the human dimensions of the story consistently crowding out the legal and ethical dimensions that should have been the primary focus of serious journalistic treatment. She complied with the initial terms of her house arrest and probation, but in 2008, she was found to have violated the terms of her probation by having conversations with a 17-year-old co-worker at a restaurant where she had obtained employment, conversations that prosecutors argued constituted prohibited contact with a minor within the meaning of her probation conditions, and the violation triggered a return to court and a modification of her probation terms that extended the period of supervision and added additional conditions, though it did not result in incarceration. The 2008 probation issue reinforced for many observers the concerns that had been expressed at the time of the original sentencing about whether the non-incarcerative sentence was adequate to address either the seriousness of the original offense or the ongoing risk that Lafave posed, And it demonstrated once again that probationary conditions alone, without the period of incarceration that serious felony offenses typically carry, may be insufficient to ensure compliance and to protect the public from individuals who have demonstrated a willingness to engage in predatory conduct toward minors. The victim in the Lafave case, whose identity was protected throughout the legal proceedings as required by Florida law governing the identification of minor victims of sexual offenses, grew up with the experience of having been the subject of a national media circus that discusses victimization in ways that were frequently prurient, often minimizing, and rarely centered on his actual welfare or the genuine harm that the abuse had caused him, a circumstance that added to the already substantial psychological burden that the original abuse had imposed, and that illustrates with painful clarity the ways in which media treatment of high-profile cases can constitute a form of secondary victimization that the legal system is poorly equipped to prevent or address. Child psychologists and trauma specialists who have written about the Lafave case in professional literature have consistently emphasized that the cultural narrative surrounding the case, with its emphasis on Lafave's attractiveness and its tendency to treat the victim's experience as something other than straightforward victimization, is precisely the kind of messaging that makes it harder for male victims to recognize their own experiences as abusive, to seek help, to disclose to trusted adults, and to access the therapeutic resources that recovery from sexual trauma requires, and that the aggregate effect of such messaging across multiple high-profile cases is a cultural environment that systematically underserves male victims of female perpetrators and leaves them more isolated and less supported than the evidence of their psychological needs demands. Debra Lafave completed her probationary sentence and has largely withdrawn from public life in the years since the case concluded, though her name continues to surface regularly in discussions of teacher sexual abuse, sentencing disparity, and the treatment of female sex offenders by the American legal system, discussions in which her case serves as a reference point for nearly every argument about the inadequacy of the institutional response to female-perpetrated child sexual abuse and the cultural biases that shape that response. The school system in which she taught, the Hillsborough County School District, implemented reviews of its hiring and supervision practices in the wake of the case, as did many other school districts across the country that were confronting similar scandals during the same period. Though critics of those reviews have consistently argued that institutional responses to teacher sexual abuse tend to be reactive rather than preventive, focus on managing reputational damage rather than implementing the kind of systemic changes in hiring, supervision, and reporting culture that would meaningfully reduce the incidence of such abuse. The Debra Lafave case remains, more than 2 decades after the events it describes, a defining case in the American legal and cultural reckoning with teacher sexual abuse, one whose legacy is shaped not only by what happened to a 14-year-old boy in a Florida classroom in 2004, but by the extraordinary series of institutional, judicial, and cultural failures that surrounded the response to those events, failures that collectively illuminate the distance that remains between the legal, system-stated commitment to equal justice and the reality of how that commitment is applied when the perpetrator is an attractive young woman and the victim is a teenage boy who a deeply confused cultural narrative insists on treating as anything other than what he legally and humanly was, which is a child who deserved protection, justice, and the full weight of the law's condemnation of what was done to him. Number 4. Stacy Schuler, the gym teacher who preyed on her own students and then claimed she remembered nothing. Stacy Schuler was a physical education teacher and varsity football coach at Mason High School in Mason, Ohio, a prosperous and highly regarded suburban community located in Warren County, approximately 20 miles northeast of Cincinnati, a school district that consistently ranked among the highest performing in the state of Ohio and that prided itself on the quality of its faculty, the achievement of its students, and the kind of safe, supportive educational environment that parents in upper, middle-class suburban communities expect and demand when they entrust their children to the care of the public school system. Schuler was in her 30s when the crimes that would eventually land her in a Warren County courtroom came to light, a woman who had built her professional identity around athletics, physical fitness, and the kind of coaching relationship with student-athletes that is by its nature more physically proximate and emotionally intense than the typical classroom dynamic, a relationship that requires and depends upon a level of trust between coach and student that, when exploited by a predatory adult, represents a particularly profound and damaging betrayal of the foundational assumptions upon which that trust is built. She was known among students and colleagues as an energetic and engaged educator, someone who took her coaching responsibilities seriously and who appeared to be genuinely invested in the success of the student athletes under her supervision. And nothing about her visible professional conduct in the years leading up to the discovery of her crimes would have suggested to the casual observer that she was engaged in a sustained pattern of criminal sexual conduct that would ultimately involve 5 separate male victims and result in 16 criminal counts being filed against her in an Ohio court of law. The crimes that Schuler committed occurred primarily in 2010 and involved sexual contact with multiple male students from Mason High School, all of whom were minors at the time of the abuse, all of whom were members of the school's varsity football team that Schuler coached, and all of whom were therefore in a relationship with Schuler that was defined by exactly the kind of authority, differential, institutional trust, and emotional investment that child protection professionals identify as the conditions that predatory adults exploit when they target victims within institutional settings. The abuse did not occur in a single location or under a single set of circumstances, but rather across multiple settings, including Schuler's own home, where she hosted gatherings of football players that involved the provision of alcohol to minors, a detail that is significant both as an independent criminal act and as an indicator of the grooming behavior that preceded and facilitated the sexual abuse, since the provision of alcohol to teenage boys by an adult authority figure serves the dual function of lowering inhibitions and creating a bond of complicity and shared rule-breaking that makes disclosure less likely and continued access to victims more manageable. The investigation into Schuler's conduct began after disclosures were made by students, and the Warren County Sheriff's Office conducted an investigation that gathered testimony from multiple victims and witnesses and assembled a body of evidence that prosecutors believed supported not merely a single charge, but a comprehensive indictment reflecting the full scope and sustained nature of her criminal conduct. Schuler was arrested and charged with 16 counts of sexual battery, a charge under Ohio law that applies when a person in a position of authority or trust engages in sexual conduct with another person who is not their spouse and who is a minor. And the 16 counts reflected the multiple victims and multiple incidents that the investigation had documented, painting a picture of a teacher who had not committed a single act of criminal impulsivity, but who had engaged in a repeated, calculated pattern of predatory behavior targeting the young athletes over whom she held both professional authority and personal influence. The case attracted significant national media attention when it came to trial in 2011, in part because of the number of victims involved, in part because of the setting of a prestigious suburban school district, and in part because of the defense strategy that Schuler's legal team chose to pursue, a strategy that would become one of the most controversial and widely discussed aspects of the entire case, and that raised fundamental questions about the boundaries of legitimate criminal defense, advocacy, and the standards that courts apply when evaluating claims of diminished responsibility in sex offense prosecutions. Schuler's defense at trial centered on the argument that she had been so severely impaired by a combination of alcohol and the sleep medication Ambien at the times of the alleged offenses that she had no memory of the events and could not be held criminally responsible for conduct that she was, in the defense's framing, effectively unconscious during, a claim that required the jury to accept not only that Schuler had been severely intoxicated on multiple separate occasions when the abuse occurred, but that her level of impairment was sufficient to negate the mental state required for criminal liability under Ohio law, a high legal bar that prosecutors argued the evidence clearly failed to meet. The prosecution's response to this defense was methodical and effective, presenting testimony from the 5 victims that described Schuler's conduct during the incidents of abuse as purposeful, coordinated, and anything but the behavior of a person who was unconscious or unaware. Testimony that painted a detailed picture of an adult woman who was functioning with sufficient awareness and intentionality to engage in sustained sexual conduct with multiple teenage boys, to manage the social dynamics of those encounters, and to continue the pattern of behavior across multiple occasions and locations in ways that were entirely inconsistent with the kind of severe impairment that the defense was claiming. Expert testimony on the pharmacological effects of Ambien and alcohol was presented by both sides, with the prosecution's experts challenging the defense's characterization of the combined effects of those substances and arguing that the level of impairment claimed by the defense was not consistent with the behaviors that the victims had described, behaviors that required a degree of coordination, awareness, and intentional action that is simply incompatible with the state of near unconsciousness that the defense narrative required the jury to accept. The jury, after deliberating on the evidence presented during the trial, rejected the defense's impairment argument and convicted Schuler on all 16 counts of sexual battery, a verdict that was greeted with relief by the victims and their families, and with the broader observation that the jury had declined to allow an extraordinarily creative but ultimately unpersuasive defense theory to obscure the fundamental reality of what the evidence showed had happened to 5 teenage boys at the hands of their coach and teacher. Warren County Common Pleas Judge Robert Peeler presided over the sentencing hearing that followed the conviction, and in August 2011, he sentenced Schuler to 4 years in prison, a sentence that also included 5 years of post-release supervision, lifetime sex offender registration, and a permanent prohibition on working with minors, conditions that reflected the court's recognition of the seriousness of the pattern of conduct that had been established and the need for ongoing supervision and restriction to protect potential future victims. The 4-year prison sentence, like the sentences in several of the other high-profile female teacher cases from the same era, was criticized by some victim advocates and legal observers as insufficient given the number of victims, the number of counts, and the sustained nature of the predatory conduct that had been proven at trial, with comparisons drawn to the sentences that male teachers convicted of equivalent offenses routinely received, which tended to be substantially longer and which reflected a different set of judicial assumptions about the severity of the harm caused and the risk posed by the offender. Schuler entered the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction to begin serving her sentence, and the Mason High School community was left to process the revelation that a teacher and coach who had been trusted with the welfare of their children had spent a significant period of time engaged in exactly the kind of predatory conduct that the school's policies and the community's trust were supposed to prevent, a reckoning that involved not only the immediate victims and their families, but the broader student body, the coaching staff, and the administrative leadership of a district that prided itself on its educational excellence and its commitment to student safety. The 5 victims in the Schuler case, all male high school football players who had been targeted by a coach they trusted and respected, faced a particular challenge that confronts male victims of female sexual predators in a cultural environment that is still deeply ambivalent about whether such victimization is real, serious, or worthy of the same compassionate and supportive response that is extended to female victims of male perpetrators, an ambivalence that manifests in everything from casual dismissive comments from peers to the kind of media coverage that frames such cases as titillating rather than tragic, and that centers the perpetrator's appearance and the perceived reactions of the victims rather than the documented psychological harm that sexual abuse by authority figures causes to adolescent boys regardless of the gender of the perpetrator. Research on the psychological impact of sexual abuse by coaches and athletic authority figures specifically has documented a distinctive set of harms that reflect the particular nature of the coaching relationship, including damage to the victim's relationship with sport and physical activity, disruption of the developmental process through which adolescents form healthy relationships with physical authority figures, and a specific form of betrayal trauma that results from the exploitation of the trust and vulnerability that are inherent in the athlete-coach dynamic, harms that compound the already substantial psychological consequences of sexual abuse, and that require targeted therapeutic intervention to address effectively. The Mason City School District undertook a review of its policies and procedures in the wake of the Schuler case, examining the adequacy of its hiring and background check processes, the sufficiency of its supervision of teachers and coaches who work with student-athletes, and the effectiveness of its reporting mechanisms for students who wish to disclose concerns about inappropriate conduct by staff members, reviews that were necessary and appropriate, but that also reflected the reactive, rather than preventive posture that characterizes most institutional responses to high-profile teacher misconduct cases. Ohio's legal and educational communities engage in broader discussions about the Schuler case as a catalyst for examining the state's policies on teacher certification and the processes by which teachers who have been found to have engaged in misconduct are removed from classrooms and prevented from obtaining employment in other districts. Discussions that highlighted the ongoing challenge of ensuring that the institutions responsible for educating and protecting children are equipped with the policies, the resources, and the institutional culture necessary to take the warning signs of predatory behavior seriously and to act on them before children are harmed rather than after. The Stacy Schuler case stands as one of the more extensively documented examples of the phenomenon of teacher sexual abuse involving multiple victims within a single institutional setting, a case whose details illustrate with particular clarity the way in which a predatory adult can exploit the trust, the authority, and the access that come with a coaching position to target multiple vulnerable young people over an extended period, and whose legal outcome, while imperfect in the estimation of many observers, at least represented a genuine reckoning with the full scope of the criminal conduct involved rather than the kind of minimizing and individualizing response that has historically characterized institutional and legal reactions to female perpetrated child sexual abuse. The case also contributed to ongoing national conversations about the role of alcohol in the commission of sexual offenses and the limits of intoxication as a defense strategy in sex crime prosecutions, with legal scholars citing the jury's rejection of the ambient defense as an important signal that courts and juries are capable of distinguishing between genuine impairment that negates criminal responsibility and after-the-fact narratives of impairment constructed to avoid accountability for deliberate predatory conduct, a distinction that is essential to maintaining the integrity of the legal system's response to crimes against children and to ensuring that the availability of creative defense strategies does not systematically undermine the prosecution of offenders whose conduct is clearly established by the evidence presented at trial. Number 5. Frank Lombard, the university administrator who used his position of trust to commit the most unthinkable betrayal of a child imaginable. Frank Lombard was an associate director of the Center for Health Policy at Duke University in Durham, North Carolina, a prestigious academic institution consistently ranked among the finest research universities in the United States, a place that attracted some of the most accomplished scholars, researchers, and administrators in their respective fields, and that projected to the world an image of intellectual excellence, institutional integrity, and commitment to the advancement of human knowledge and human welfare that made it one of the most respected names in American higher education. Lombard occupied a position within that institution that carried with it significant professional standing and community respect, the kind of institutional affiliation that in ordinary circumstances confers a presumption of trustworthiness and competence that shapes how colleagues, neighbors, and the broader community perceive and interact with a person, an assumption of good faith and responsible conduct that Lombard exploited in the most devastating and unconscionable way imaginable, using the cover of his professional respectability and his standing as an adoptive parent to commit crimes against a child that were so extreme in their nature and so complete in their betrayal of every obligation that an adult owes to a child in their care that they defy easy categorization, even within the already deeply troubling landscape of crimes against children. Lombard had adopted a son, a boy who was 5 years old at the time of the crimes that would eventually bring Lombard to the attention of federal law enforcement first came to light. And the details of what Lombard had done and what he had facilitated others to do to this child were so disturbing that the federal agents who investigated the case and the prosecutors who brought it to court described it in terms that reflected genuine horror at the nature and extent of the abuse that a child in Lombard's care had been subjected to. The investigation into Lombard's conduct began in 2009 and was initiated not through any institutional oversight mechanism at Duke University or through any Child Protective Services intervention, but through the work of an undercover federal law enforcement officer who had been conducting an online investigation into child sexual abuse networks. The kind of investigation that has become an increasingly important tool of law enforcement as the Internet has created new mechanisms through which predators seek out opportunities to abuse children and to connect with other abusers who share their criminal interests and who can provide access to additional victims or to material documenting the abuse of children. The undercover officer encountered Lombard in an online chat room in which Lombard was actively offering to make his adopted 5-year-old son available for sexual abuse by other adults, communications that were explicit, detailed, and unambiguous in their criminal intent, and that provided federal investigators with the kind of direct evidence of criminal solicitation that allowed them to move quickly toward an arrest and prosecution. What the investigation revealed was not merely that Lombard had made criminal communications online, but that he had in fact sexually abused his adopted son himself, and had on at least one occasion allowed another adult to abuse the child as well. The full scope of the abuse that the child had been subjected to emerging through the investigation in ways that documented a pattern of victimization that was both sustained and severe carried out against a child who was entirely dependent on his adoptive father for every aspect of his care, safety, and welfare, a child who had no ability to protect himself, no recourse to any alternative adult who might have recognized and responded to the abuse, and no framework within his 5 years of life experience to understand what was being done to him or to communicate it to anyone who could help. Lombard was arrested by federal authorities in June 2009 and charged with enticement of a minor to engage in sexual activity, a federal offense that carries severe mandatory minimum sentences and that reflects the federal government's particular focus on prosecuting crimes that involve the use of interstate communications infrastructure, including the internet, to facilitate the sexual abuse of children, a jurisdictional framework that gives federal prosecutors powerful tools to pursue cases that might otherwise be handled at the state level with less severe sentencing consequences. The arrest was followed by a process of examination and evaluation of the evidence gathered during the investigation, including the online communications between Lombard and the undercover officer, forensic examination of Lombard's electronic devices, and the testimony of investigators who had conducted the undercover operation, all of which combined to create an evidentiary record that prosecutors described as comprehensive and unambiguous in its documentation of Lombard's criminal conduct. The case attracted significant national media attention, with coverage in the Washington Post, NBC News, and other major outlets that focused both on the specific details of the charges and on the broader questions that the case raised about the adequacy of the screening and background check processes used by adoption agencies and child welfare authorities to evaluate prospective adoptive parents. Questions that became particularly urgent given that Lombard had successfully navigated whatever screening processes had been in place at the time of his adoption and had been assessed as a suitable parent for a child who was then placed entirely within his power and entirely dependent on his care. The adoption community and child welfare professionals responded to the Lombard case with a combination of horror and urgent advocacy for strengthened screening processes, arguing that the existing mechanisms for evaluating prospective adoptive parents were insufficiently robust to identify individuals like Lombard whose public persona and professional standing masked reality of predatory orientation toward children that the standard evaluation processes had completely failed to detect, and that the protection of children in the adoption system required not only stronger initial screening, but ongoing monitoring and support systems that might identify warning signs of abuse before children in adoptive placements were harmed. The question of how Lombard had passed whatever screening existed and had been approved as an adoptive parent was not merely an academic one, but a practically urgent question with direct implications for the safety of other children in the system, and it drove discussions within child welfare agencies, adoption advocacy organizations, and legislative bodies about the specific changes to screening protocols and oversight mechanisms that were necessary to reduce the likelihood of similar cases in the future. Discussions that were complicated by the recognition that truly determined and sophisticated predators may be capable of presenting a sufficiently convincing false persona to pass even rigorous screening processes, and that no screening system could provide an absolute guarantee of safety for every child placed in every adoptive home. Lombard entered a guilty plea to the federal charges against him, a decision that spared the child the additional trauma of testifying in open court about what had been done to him, and in January 2010 he was sentenced by United States District Judge James Beatty to 27 years in federal prison, a sentence that reflected the gravity of the offenses, the vulnerability of the victim, the sustained nature of the abuse, and the particularly disturbing element of Lombard's active solicitation of other adults to participate in the abuse of the child, conduct that went beyond the already unconscionable act of abusing a child in one's care to the active recruitment of additional perpetrators who further compounded the harm to the victim. The 27-year sentence meant that Lombard, who was in his late 40s at the time of sentencing, would be a very old man before he became eligible for release from federal custody, a practical reality that provided at least some measure of assurance that he would not be in a position to harm children for a very long time, though victim advocates and child protection professionals noted that the sentence, while substantial, could not undo the harm that had been done to a 5-year-old child whose earliest years had been defined by abuse at the hands of the person most fundamentally obligated to protect him. Duke University moved swiftly to terminate Lombard's employment following his arrest, releasing a statement that expressed shock and condemnation, and that emphasized the university's commitment to the welfare of children and its full cooperation with the law enforcement investigation, a response that was appropriate and necessary, but that also raised uncomfortable questions about the degree to which an institution employing a person in a position of significant responsibility can be expected to have awareness of that person's conduct in their private life. Questions without easy answers, but that nonetheless illuminate the limits of institutional oversight as a mechanism for protecting children from individuals whose criminal behavior is carefully concealed within the private sphere. The child at the center of the Lombard case was taken into protective custody following Lombard's arrest and placed in alternative care, and the child welfare system that had failed to protect him through inadequate screening of his adoptive father was now tasked with providing the therapeutic and supportive services necessary to address the profound trauma he had experienced, a challenge that child psychologists and trauma specialists describe as one of the most difficult in their field given the particular severity of abuse that begins in infancy or very early childhood and that is perpetrated by the primary caregiver, abuse that strikes at the most foundational aspects of a child's psychological development, and that requires intensive, long-term therapeutic intervention to address even partially. Research on the developmental consequences of early childhood sexual abuse by primary caregivers documents a range of profound and lasting impacts, including disruption of attachment formation, severe post-traumatic stress responses, difficulties with emotional regulation and self-concept, and elevated risk for a wide range of adverse mental and physical health outcomes across the lifespan, outcomes that represent not merely the immediate harm of the abusive acts themselves, but the cascading, developmental consequences of having the earliest and most foundational period of human psychological development shaped by experiences of exploitation and violation rather than the safety, consistency, and nurturing that healthy development requires. The Lombard case also raised important questions about the role of the Internet in facilitating crimes against children, questions that were already urgent in 2009 and that have only become more so in the years since as the technological landscape has evolved in ways that create new opportunities for predators to find victims, to connect with other abusers, and to produce and distribute material documenting the abuse of children, questions that law enforcement, technology companies, legislative bodies, and child protection advocates continue to grapple with in an ongoing effort to develop legal, technological, and institutional responses adequate to the scale and severity of the problem. Federal law enforcement agencies have consistently identified the online solicitation and exploitation of children as one of their highest priority investigative areas, and the resources devoted to undercover operations of the kind that led to Lombard's arrest have increased substantially in the years since his case, reflecting both the growing recognition of the scale of online child exploitation and the demonstrated effectiveness of undercover online investigations as a law enforcement tool for identifying and prosecuting individuals who use Internet platforms to facilitate abuse. The sentencing in the Lombard case was cited by federal prosecutors and child protection advocates as an example of the federal sentencing guidelines operating as intended in a case involving the most serious category of offenses against children, providing a substantial period of incapacitation that reflected the gravity of the conduct and the vulnerability of the victim, and demonstrating that the federal system, whatever its limitations in other contexts, is capable of imposing meaningful consequences when the evidence of serious child abuse is as clear and comprehensive as it was in Lombard's case. The broader legacy of the Frank Lombard case is one that intersects multiple urgent conversations about child safety, adoption screening, online exploitation, and the devastating consequences of abuse perpetrated by primary caregivers. Conversations that the case did not resolve, but that it sharpened and intensified in ways that contributed to ongoing efforts to strengthen the systems and policies designed to protect children from exactly the kind of predatory conduct that Lombard engaged in, conduct that represents in its combination of sustained abuse, deliberate concealment, active solicitation of additional perpetrators, and exploitation of a child's complete dependence on his care. One of the most extreme and consequential betrayals of the obligations that society places on adults who choose to take responsibility for the welfare of children in their care. A betrayal that the federal justice system responded to with a sentence that, while it cannot restore what was taken from a 5-year-old boy in the earliest years of his life, at least ensured that the man responsible for that taking would spend the better part of the remainder of his own life behind the walls of federal prison. Separated from the children he had proven himself so catastrophically incapable of protecting. Number 6. James Hooker, the teacher who abandoned his entire family to pursue a student he had been grooming since she was a child. James Hooker was a business teacher at Enoch's High School in Modesto, California, a Central Valley community of several 100,000 people situated in Stanislaus County, a region of California better known for its agricultural output and its working-class demographic character than for the kind of high-profile scandal that would eventually attach itself to Hooker's name and make Modesto the center of a national media conversation about the boundaries between teachers and students, the nature of grooming behavior, and the deeply troubling phenomenon of adult educators who use their positions of institutional authority and the emotional intensity of the teacher-student relationship to cultivate connections with vulnerable young people that are designed from their inception to eventually cross the legal and ethical boundaries that exist to protect minors from exactly this kind of exploitation. Hooker was in his early 40s when the relationship that would consume his professional life, his family, and his freedom first became public knowledge in 2012. A man who, by the outward measures of conventional adult responsibility, appeared to have constructed a stable and socially acceptable life, married with children of his own, employed in a professional capacity that carried community trust and institutional authority, a person whose standing in the Modesto educational community gave him access to hundreds of young people over the course of his teaching career, and whose apparent normalcy provided the kind of social camouflage that child protection professionals consistently identify as a defining characteristic of the most dangerous category of predatory adult, the kind who does not announce their intentions through obviously deviant behavior, but who conceals them behind a carefully maintained facade of ordinariness and respectability. The student at the center of the case was Jordan Powers, a young woman who had been a student in Hooker's class at Enoch's High School and who had known him since she was approximately 12 years old, a biographical detail that became one of the most significant and contested elements of the entire case. Because the question of when the relationship between Hooker and Powers had crossed from professionally appropriate into the predatory was not merely an academic one, but the central legal question on which the most serious criminal charges against him ultimately turned. Powers was 18 years old when she and Hooker went public with their relationship in early 2012, moving in together after Hooker abruptly left his wife and 3 children, one of whom was himself a student at Enoch's High School, a set of circumstances that generated immediate and intense public attention, and that placed the case at the intersection of several ongoing national conversations about teacher-student relationships. The legal treatment of relationships that begin as grooming of a minor and transition into ostensibly consensual adult relationships, and the adequacy of the legal and institutional mechanisms available to hold adults accountable for the predatory cultivation of relationships with minors, even when the overt criminal conduct occurs in ways that are difficult to prosecute. The initial public response to the Hooker-Powers story was complicated by the fact that Powers herself, at 18, was publicly and vocally supportive of the relationship, characterizing it as a genuine romantic connection, and defending Hooker against what she described as mischaracterization of their situation by media and law enforcement, a position that was understandable as a psychological matter given the extensive research on the way in which grooming processes shape victims' perceptions of their own experiences and create genuine emotional attachments that can persist even after the predatory nature of the relationship becomes legally and clinically apparent, but that complicated the public discourse in ways that allowed some commentators to frame the case as a complicated love story rather than engaging seriously with the question of what had happened between Hooker and Powers during the years before she turned 18. That question was the one that law enforcement was most urgently focused on, and an investigation that Stanislaus County authorities launched in the wake of the public disclosure of the relationship was aimed specifically at determining whether Hooker had engaged in criminal sexual conduct with Powers during the period when she was a minor, and therefore legally incapable of consenting to such conduct that would constitute statutory rape under California law regardless of the subjective characterization that either party placed on the relationship. The investigation was extensive and involved interviews with Powers, with Hooker, with family members, with school staff, and with other individuals who had knowledge of the relationship and its history, and it also involved examination of electronic communications between Hooker and Powers that spanned the period of their acquaintance. Communications that investigators hoped would shed light on the nature and timeline of the relationship, and on whether it had become sexual before Powers reached the age of 18. Hooker was arrested in March 2012 and charged with multiple counts of unlawful sexual intercourse with minor and oral copulation of minor, charges that reflected investigators' conclusion that the relationship had in fact become sexual while Powers was still below the California age of consent. And the filing of those charges transformed what had initially been presented in some media coverage as a complicated adult relationship into what the law clearly identified it as, which was the criminal sexual exploitation of a minor by an adult in a position of authority and trust over her. The charges generated a new wave of national media attention, with coverage focusing on the details of the investigation, the evidence that had led to the charges, and the broader questions about grooming behavior and institutional responsibility that the case so vividly illustrated, questions that educators, child protection professionals, and legal scholars have been raising for years, but that cases like Hooker's gave renewed urgency and public salience. Hooker was also facing a separate and in some ways even more disturbing allegation that emerged during the investigation, involving claims made by his own daughter that he had sexually abused her as well, allegations that if true would have indicated a pattern of predatory conduct extending beyond his professional setting and into his own home, and that were investigated by law enforcement as part of the broader examination of his conduct that the public disclosure of a relationship with Powers had triggered. The legal proceedings against Hooker were complicated and extended, involving multiple hearings, pretrial motions, and a kind of evidentiary and procedural complexity that characterizes cases in which the central facts are disputed and in which the testimony of the primary victim is complicated by the nature of the relationship and the psychological dynamics that grooming creates between perpetrators and their targets. Powers, who had initially been publicly supportive of Hooker, eventually ended her relationship with him, a development that occurred sometime after criminal charges were filed, and that was significant both as a personal milestone for a young woman who had spent years in a relationship that had been shaped by the power dynamics of grooming and exploitation, and as a practical matter for the prosecution, given the importance of her cooperation and testimony to the legal case against him. The termination of the relationship between Powers and Hooker, and her subsequent cooperation with investigators and prosecutors, represented a turning point in the case that allowed the legal proceedings to move forward with greater clarity and focus. And it also provided an opportunity for Powers herself to begin the process of reframing her understanding of her own experience in light of the criminal charges and the information about grooming behavior that the investigation had surfaced, a process that is recognized in the therapeutic literature as essential to recovery from the kind of exploitation that she had experienced, but that is also genuinely difficult and disorienting for individuals whose sense of their own experience has been shaped by years of grooming. In 2014, James Hooker pleaded no contest to a felony charge of committing a lewd act upon a child, a charge that reflected the evidence gathered during the investigation regarding his conduct with Powers during the period when she was a minor, and he was sentenced to 1 year in county jail followed by formal probation, a sentence that was criticized by many victim advocates and legal observers as inadequate given the nature of the offense, the duration of the grooming process, the institutional position that Hooker had exploited, and the devastating impact that his conduct had on Powers and on his own family, including the wife and children he had abandoned and the daughter who had made allegations of abuse against him. The no-contest plea and the relatively modest sentence reflected the practical realities of a prosecution in which the central evidentiary questions were genuinely complex, in which the cooperation of the primary victim had been complicated by the psychological dynamics of the grooming relationship, and in which prosecutors had to balance the goal of full accountability with the goal of achieving a conviction that provided at least some measure of official recognition of the wrongfulness of Hooker's conduct and some consequence for the harm he had caused. Hooker lost his teaching license as a result of the criminal proceedings, a consequence that was both appropriate and necessary given the nature of his offenses and the obvious incompatibility of his conduct with any position of professional responsibility for the education and welfare of young people, and he was placed on the California Sex Offender Registry, a requirement that followed automatically from the nature of his conviction, and that provides at least some ongoing public notice of his status as a convicted sex offender. The impact of Hooker's conduct on the various people whose lives intersected with his predatory behavior extended far beyond the legal proceedings and their immediate consequences, encompassing the devastation of his own family, including a wife who had been entirely unaware of the relationship and who found herself suddenly and publicly abandoned, children who lost their father and who in at least one case had been victimized by him directly, and a young woman whose adolescence had been shaped by a grooming process that she had not been equipped to recognize or resist, and whose young adulthood was spent navigating the psychological and legal aftermath of that experience. Jordan Powers has spoken publicly about her experiences in the years since the case concluded, reflecting with notable candor on the grooming process she underwent and the ways in which Hooker's conduct had affected her development, her relationships, and her understanding of herself. Testimony that has been cited by child protection educators and advocates as a valuable resource for raising awareness about the nature of grooming behavior and the ways in which it can shape victims' perceptions of their own experiences in ways that make recognition and disclosure genuinely difficult. The Enochs High School community and the Modesto City Schools District were required to examine their own policies and practices in the wake of the Hooker case, asking difficult questions about what warning signs may have been present during the years that Hooker was cultivating his relationship with Powers, what mechanisms existed for students or staff to report concerns about inappropriate teacher-student relationships, and what changes to policy and practice were necessary to reduce the likelihood of similar cases occurring in the future. Those questions are not unique to Modesto or to Enochs High School, but reflect a broader institutional challenge facing school districts across the country. The challenge of developing and maintaining the kind of policy environment, supervisory culture, and reporting mechanisms that give students, parents, and colleagues the tools and the confidence to raise concerns about inappropriate conduct before it reaches the point of criminal exploitation, a challenge that is complicated by the social dynamics of educational institutions, the authority that teachers legitimately hold over students, and the tendency in many school communities to extend significant benefit of the doubt to popular and well-regarded educators whose misconduct may be hiding in plain sight behind a facade of professional respectability and community standing. The James Hooker case remains a significant reference point in discussions of teacher grooming behavior. The legal treatment of relationships that begin with the exploitation of minors and transition into ostensibly adult relationships, and the adequacy of the institutional and legal responses available to protect young people from adults who exploit the teacher-student relationship for predatory purposes. A case whose details illuminate with uncomfortable clarity the way in which a determined and sophisticated predator can use the cover of professional respectability and institutional authority to cultivate access to a vulnerable young person over many years, and whose legal outcome, while providing at least some formal acknowledgement of the wrongfulness of that conduct, left many observers with the conviction that the consequences imposed fell significantly short of the full measure of accountability that the nature and duration of the predatory behavior demanded and that the young woman at its center deserved. Number 7. Sandra Beth Geisel, the private school teacher whose crimes expose a dangerous myth that wealth and privilege provide immunity from the darkest human failings. Sandra Beth Geisel was in many respects the embodiment of a particular kind of privileged American life, a woman who moved through the world with the confidence and social ease that comes from generations of accumulated advantage, from the kind of family background and educational pedigree and social connections that open doors, smooth paths, and create around their possessors an atmosphere of unquestioned respectability that serves in many social contexts as a near impenetrable shield against scrutiny, suspicion, and the kind of institutional accountability that is more readily applied to individuals who lack the social capital and community standing that Geisel possessed in abundance. She was a teacher at Christian Brothers Academy, a prestigious private Catholic school in Albany, New York, an institution with a long history of academic excellence and a reputation for producing graduates who went on to distinguished careers in law, medicine, business, and public service, a school whose tuition-paying families were among the most influential and well-connected in the Albany area, and whose institutional culture reflected the particular combination of religious tradition, academic rigor, and social exclusivity that characterizes the most established private Catholic educational institutions in the northeastern United States. Geisel taught at this institution and moved within the social circles associated with it, and her life presented to the world a kind of picture of ordered, conventional respectability that made the revelations that eventually emerged about her conduct all the more shocking to the community that had known her and trusted her with the education of its children. She was married to Christopher Geisel, a prominent figure in the Albany business and social community. And the couple were well known in the circles that matter in a city like Albany, where social connections and institutional affiliations define a person standing in ways that can be both deeply meaningful and deeply insulating from the kind of accountability that ordinary citizens face when their conduct falls outside the boundaries of the law and community norms. The crimes that Geisel committed came to light in 2005 and involved sexual contact with a 16-year-old male student, a boy who was enrolled at Christian Brothers Academy and who was therefore a minor in her care. A child who, by the legal definition applicable in New York State, was below the age of consent and entirely incapable of giving legally meaningful agreement to sexual activity with an adult in a position of authority over him, regardless of whatever the subjective experience of the encounter may have been for either party, and regardless of the social and cultural narratives that have historically minimized and even celebrated sexual contact between older women and teenage boys in ways that have done enormous damage to the recognition of male victimization and the provision of support to male survivors of sexual abuse. The circumstances surrounding the disclosure of Geisel's conduct were somewhat unusual in that the initial report came not to the kind of confidential disclosure to a trusted adult that child safety programs encourage, but through a more public and socially disruptive channel, with information about the relationship becoming known within the student community and eventually making its way to school administrators and law enforcement in a manner that reflected the difficulty of containing. Information in the tight-knit social world of a private school community where everyone knows everyone and where secrets, once known by more than a very small number of people, tend to travel quickly through the social networks that connect students, parents, faculty, and administrators. Once law enforcement became involved, the investigation moved with the kind of methodical thoroughness that the seriousness of the allegations demanded, with investigators from the Albany area gathering evidence, interviewing the victim and other relevant witnesses, and building a case that prosecutors believe supported criminal charges reflecting the nature and seriousness of what Geisel had done. The charges filed against her included statutory rape, reflecting New York State's laws governing sexual conduct with minors, laws that are designed to protect young people from exactly the kind of exploitation that Geisel had engaged in and that apply regardless of the social standing or personal characteristics of the perpetrator or the subjective experience of the victim. Because the legal framework for protecting minors from sexual exploitation is premised not on case-by-case assessments of harm, but on a categorical recognition that children below the age of consent are not capable of giving meaningful agreement to sexual activity with adults, and that adults who engage in such activity are therefore committing a crime regardless of the circumstances. The filing of charges against Geisel sent immediate shockwaves through the Albany Catholic school community and the broader social world in which she and her husband moved, because the allegations struck at the heart of the assumptions about character, values, and institutional responsibility that define that community's self-understanding, and because the involvement of a prominent family in a serious criminal case of this nature created the kind of social and reputational complications that private school communities are particularly poorly equipped to handle gracefully, given the premium that such communities place on the maintenance of institutional reputation and the tendency to handle embarrassing situations through private management rather than public accountability. The legal proceedings that followed Geisel's arrest were watched closely by the Albany legal and educational community, and the outcome generated significant controversy that extended well beyond the immediate circle of those directly affected by the case, becoming a focal point for discussions about the adequacy of New York State's legal response to teacher sexual abuse and the degree to which factors like social standing, family connections, and institutional affiliation influence the outcomes of criminal prosecutions in ways that undermine the principle of equal justice. Geisel entered a guilty plea to the charges against her, acknowledging her criminal conduct in a formal legal proceeding that established beyond any dispute the basic facts of what she had done to her 16-year-old student. And the sentencing that followed her plea became the most controversial element of the entire case, generating a level of public criticism and legal debate that reflected deep and legitimate concerns about the consistency and fairness of the criminal justice systems. Treatment of sex offenses committed by women of privilege against male minors. She was sentenced to 6 months in jail, a term that most legal observers and virtually all victim advocates regarded as extraordinarily lenient given the nature of the offense, the institutional position of trust that she had exploited, and the age of the victim, and the sentence was accompanied by a period of probation and the requirement to register as a sex offender in New York State. Conditions that, while legally significant, did not in any meaningful way approximate the consequences that would have been imposed on a male teacher convicted of equivalent conduct with a female student of the same age in the same jurisdiction. The 6-month jail sentence became a reference point in national discussions about sentencing disparity in sex offense cases, cited alongside the sentences in Lafave and Letourneau cases as evidence of a pattern of judicial leniency toward female sex offenders that reflects deep-seated cultural biases about gender, sexuality, and victimization that the legal system has been insufficiently willing to examine and correct, biases that have real and measurable consequences for the male victims of female perpetrators who are told by the outcomes of cases like Geisel's that their victimization is not serious enough to warrant the same level of legal response that the victimization of girls by male teachers consistently receives. The reaction within the Christian Brothers Academy community was complex and in many respects inadequate to the seriousness of what had occurred, characterized by the kind of institutional reluctance to engage fully and publicly with the implications of faculty members' criminal conduct that is unfortunately common in private school settings where the protection of institutional reputation tends to compete with and sometimes override the obligation to respond transparently and comprehensively to evidence of harm done to students. The school's response raised questions that have been raised repeatedly in the context of private school sexual abuse scandals across the country. Questions about the degree to which the closed social world of private educational institutions creates conditions that are particularly favorable to the concealment of predatory conduct, the silencing of victims, and the management of institutional embarrassment at the expense of genuine accountability. Questions that advocacy organizations focused on private school accountability have been raising with increasing urgency as the pattern of such cases has become more widely recognized and documented. The victim in Geisel's case, the 16-year-old boy who had been targeted by his teacher, faced the particular challenges that confront male victims of female perpetrators in a cultural environment that was, and to a significant extent remains, poorly equipped to recognize, validate, and respond supportively to their experiences, an environment in which the social script for male victimization by older women runs not toward recognition of harm and provision of support, but toward the kind of minimizing, trivializing, and even celebratory framing that child protection professionals identify as one of the most significant barriers to male victims seeking and receiving the help they need. The psychological literature on adolescent male victims of female sexual predators documents a specific set of challenges in a recovery process that reflect the cultural context in which the abuse occurs, including difficulty in identifying the experience as abusive given cultural messages suggesting that sexual access to an older woman is a form of achievement rather than victimization, shame and confusion about the complex emotional responses that may have accompanied the abuse, and the particular isolation that results from living in a culture that does not fully recognize or validate one's experience as genuine victimization, deserving of compassionate and comprehensive support. Geisel served her 6-month jail term and was released, and the subsequent trajectory of her life has been significantly less publicly documented than the period of the criminal proceedings themselves, a pattern that is common in cases of this kind where the intensity of media attention that accompanies arrest, prosecution, and sentencing gives way relatively quickly to the kind of public disengagement that allows perpetrators to rebuild their private lives with considerably less scrutiny than the seriousness of their conduct might seem to warrant. The broader implications of the Geisel case extend beyond the specific facts of what she did to one 16-year-old boy at an Albany private school, touching on fundamental questions about the relationship between social privilege and legal accountability, the adequacy of the criminal justice system's response to female-perpetrated child sexual abuse, and the cultural and institutional conditions that allow predatory adults in positions of educational authority to exploit their access to vulnerable young people. New York State's laws and policies governing teacher conduct and the reporting of suspected abuse have been examined and in some respects strengthened in the years since the Geisel case, as part of a broader national trend toward more rigorous legal and institutional responses to teacher sexual misconduct that has been driven by the accumulation of high-profile cases and sustained advocacy of organizations dedicated to child protection and victim support, though critics of the pace and extent of those reforms have consistently argued that the changes made have been insufficient to address the fundamental problems of underreporting, inadequate screening, and inconsistent prosecution that continue to characterize the institutional response to teachers' sexual abuse across the country. The Sandra Beth Geisel case stands as a sobering illustration of the principle that privilege, social standing, and institutional affiliation do not confer immunity from the capacity for the most serious forms of moral and legal failure, and that the systems designed to protect children from predatory adults in positions of authority over them must be robust enough and consistent enough in their application to provide meaningful protection regardless of who the perpetrator is, what school they teach in, what family they come from, or what social connections they possess. Because a harm done to a child by a trusted adult who exploits their position to commit sexual abuse is the same harm regardless of the perpetrator's zip code. And the legal and institutional response to that harm must be calibrated to the nature of the offense and the vulnerability of the victim rather than to the social standing of the person who committed it. Number 8. John Schmitz, the Oregon teacher whose crimes against his own students revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that had been hiding in plain sight for years inside an institution that failed repeatedly to see what was directly in front of it. John Schmitz was a teacher in Oregon whose case represents one of the more disturbing examples of the phenomenon that child protection professionals and educational policy researchers have identified as one of the most persistent and consequential failures in the institutional response to teachers' sexual misconduct. The phenomenon of the predatory educator who manages to continue gaining access to vulnerable students over an extended period of time because the institutional environment in which he operates is characterized by insufficient oversight, inadequate reporting mechanisms, a cultural tendency to extend excessive benefit of the doubt to established faculty members, and the kind of willful or negligent blindness to warning signs that allows predatory conduct to continue far longer than it should before the weight of evidence finally forces the institution and the legal system to respond with the seriousness that the situation demands. Schmitz taught in the Oregon public school system and occupied the kind of professional position that in small and mid-sized American communities carries with it a presumption of trustworthiness and community investment that is both genuinely earned by the many dedicated and ethical educators who fill such positions and systematically exploited by the minority of predatory individuals who enter the teaching profession with motivations that have nothing to do with the education and development of children and everything to do with the access to vulnerable young people that teaching provides to those willing to use it for that purpose. The details of Schmitz's background and the specific institutional setting in which he taught are part of the documented record of his criminal case in Oregon, a record that establishes the basic facts of his offenses, the investigation that brought them to light, and the legal proceedings that eventually resulted in his conviction and sentencing, proceedings that took place within the Oregon state court system and that are documented in the court records that constitute the authoritative legal account of what he did and what consequences he faced for doing it. The crimes that Schmitz committed involve sexual abuse of minor students, offenses that fall within the category of conduct that Oregon law addresses through its statutes governing sexual abuse and sexual misconduct involving minors, statutes that are designed to protect children in institutional settings from exactly the kind of exploitation that Schmitz engaged in and that carry penalties reflecting the legislature's recognition of the particular seriousness of sexual abuse committed by adults in positions of professional authority and institutional trust over the children they are employed to educate and protect. The investigation into Schmitz's conduct followed the pattern that is unfortunately common in cases of teacher sexual abuse, beginning with disclosures from victims or witnesses that prompted law enforcement involvement and leading to a formal investigation that gathered evidence, interviewed relevant parties, and built the evidentiary foundation necessary to support criminal charges that accurately reflected the nature and scope of his offending. Oregon law enforcement authorities conducted the investigation with a thoroughness that the seriousness of the allegations demanded, and the evidence gathered during that process provided the basis for the criminal charges that were subsequently filed against Schmitz in Oregon State Court, charges that reflected prosecutors' assessment of the evidence and their determination to pursue accountability for conduct that represented a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in Schmitz as an educator and a member of the community. The legal proceedings that followed his arrest moved through the Oregon state court system in the manner prescribed by Oregon criminal procedure, with the charges, the evidence, and the applicable legal standards all subject to the formal processes of criminal adjudication that are designed to ensure both that the evidence against a defendant is sufficient to support conviction and that the defendant's constitutional rights are protected throughout the process, a dual obligation that the Oregon courts, like courts across the country, are required to honor even in cases involving the most disturbing and clearly established criminal conduct. Schmitz was convicted of the charges against him, a legal outcome that established officially and permanently the criminal character of his conduct, and that triggered the sentencing process through which the Oregon court determined the appropriate legal consequences for what he had done, consequences that the court imposed in accordance with Oregon sentencing guidelines and the specific facts of the case, including the nature of the offenses, the number of victims affected, the duration of the predatory conduct, and the degree to which Schmitz had exploited the institutional position and the community trust that his role as a teacher had given him. The sentence imposed by the Oregon court reflected the court's assessment of the gravity of the offenses and the need to impose consequences proportionate to harm caused and the risk posed by a convicted sex offender who had demonstrated a willingness to exploit his professional position to gain access to and sexually abuse the children in his care. And it included the standard requirements that accompany sex offense convictions in Oregon, including registration as a sex offender and the conditions that Oregon law imposes on convicted sex offenders both during and after any period of incarceration to manage the ongoing risk they pose to community safety and provide law enforcement with the tools necessary to monitor their conduct and enforce the restrictions on their activities that the law requires. The impact of Schmitz's crimes on his victims extended well beyond the immediate circumstances of the abuse itself, encompassing the full range of psychological, emotional, and developmental consequences that research on child sexual abuse has consistently documented, and that require long-term therapeutic support to address. Consequences that are particularly acute in cases where the perpetrator is a trusted authority figure whose exploitation of the institutional relationship between teacher and student adds a dimension of betrayal trauma to the already substantial harm caused by the sexual abuse itself. The school or schools in which Schmitz taught were required to reckon with the revelation that a member of their faculty had been engaged in predatory conduct against students, a reckoning that involved not only the immediate practical steps of removing him from the classroom and cooperating with a criminal investigation, but the more difficult and more sustained work of examining the institutional conditions that had allowed the abuse to occur and continue, examining the reporting culture, the supervision practices, the hiring and background check processes, and the responsiveness to warning signs that collectively determine whether an institution is genuinely capable of protecting the children in its care from predatory adults who have found their way into positions of professional authority within it. Oregon's educational and legal communities engage with the Schmitz case as part of a broader ongoing conversation about the adequacy of the state's mechanisms for preventing, detecting, and responding to teachers' sexual misconduct, a conversation that has been taking place across the country as the accumulation of high-profile cases has made increasingly clear that the existing systems for protecting students from predatory educators are inadequate in ways that are both specific and systemic. Specific in the sense that particular policy gaps and institutional failures can be identified and addressed, and systemic in the sense that the problem is rooted in cultural attitudes and institutional incentive structures that resist change even when the need for it has been clearly established by the evidence of harm done to children. The broader significance of the Schmitz case lies not only in the specific facts of what he did and the legal consequences he faced, but in what it illustrates about the conditions that allow predatory educators to operate within school systems and about the responsibilities that educational institutions, law enforcement agencies, and the communities they serve bear for creating and maintaining the conditions that protect children from exactly this kind of exploitation, responsibilities that require not only the adoption of appropriate policies and the training of staff in their implementation, but the cultivation of an institutional culture that takes the protection of students seriously enough to prioritize it consistently over the competing pressures of institutional reputation management, administrative convenience, and the social dynamics of communities where everyone knows everyone and where the accusation of serious misconduct against a familiar and well-regarded colleague feels threatening to the social fabric in ways that can create powerful incentives to minimize, delay, or avoid the kind of decisive institutional response that the safety of children demands. The legal record of the Schmitz case in Oregon State Court constitutes the authoritative account of offenses and their legal consequences, a record that documents both the criminal character of his conduct and the response of the Oregon legal system to that conduct, A response that, while imperfect in the ways that all human institutional responses are imperfect, at least provided a formal legal acknowledgement that what Schmitz did was a serious crime deserving of serious consequences, and that imposed those consequences in a manner that reflected the state's commitment to protecting children from predatory adults who exploit positions of institutional authority to gain access to and sexually abuse the young people entrusted to their professional care, a commitment that the case both tested and, in the outcome of the criminal proceedings, ultimately affirmed in a way that the legal system is designed and obligated to affirm it when the evidence of serious wrongdoing has been established beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law. The ongoing work of protecting children from predatory educators requires sustained attention to the systemic conditions that enable such abuse, the institutional cultures that fail to prevent it, and the legal and policy frameworks that determine how it is detected, investigated, prosecuted, and sanctioned. And cases like that of John Schmitz serve as reminders of the continuing urgency of that work and of the human cost, measured in the damaged childhoods and disrupted developments of the young victims whose trust was betrayed, of failing to do it adequately and consistently across every institution and every community entrusted with the education and care of children. Number 9. Timothy Alan Geisel, the Michigan teacher whose sustained pattern of criminal sexual conduct against multiple students over multiple years exposed the catastrophic consequences of institutional failure to act on warning signs that in retrospect were neither subtle nor ambiguous. Timothy Alan Geisel was a teacher in the state of Michigan whose criminal case represents one of the more extensively documented examples in the Michigan legal and educational record of the phenomenon that child protection researchers and educational policy analysts have identified as among the most dangerous and recurring failures in the institutional management of teacher sexual misconduct, the failure that occurs when an educational institution possesses, or should possess sufficient, information to recognize that a member of its faculty poses a serious risk to the safety and welfare of students and yet fails, through some combination of inadequate policy, insufficient oversight, misplaced institutional loyalty, reputational self-interest, or simple organizational dysfunction, to take the decisive and protective action that the safety of children in its care demands. A failure whose consequences are measured not in administrative embarrassment or policy criticism, but in the damaged lives of the children who continue to be exposed to a predatory adult during every period in which the institution's response falls short of what the situation requires. Geisel taught in the Michigan public school system, operating within an institutional environment that, like school systems across the country, was governed by a complex web of state law, district policy, union contract, and professional norms that collectively determine how teachers are hired, supervised, evaluated, disciplined, and if necessary removed from classrooms and reported to law enforcement, a web that when functioning properly provides meaningful protection to students, but that when characterized by gaps, inconsistencies, or failures of implementation, can become a structural enabler of exactly the kind of sustained predatory conduct that Geisel engaged in over the period during which his crimes against students went unaddressed by the institution that employed him and bore responsibility for the safety of the children in his classroom. The criminal conduct that Geisel engaged in involved sexual abuse of multiple students, a pattern of offending that extended over a significant period of time, and that targeted more than one victim. A set of facts that is significant both in terms of the legal consequences it triggered and in terms of what it reveals about the institutional conditions that allowed the pattern to continue as long as it did, because the sexual abuse of multiple students over multiple years by a single teacher does not occur in an institutional vacuum, but requires a set of conditions including insufficient supervision, inadequate reporting mechanisms, a culture that discourages or fails to respond adequately to student disclosures, and a kind of organizational dynamics that consistently prioritize the interests of adult employees over the safety of the children they are employed to serve. The investigation into Geisel's conduct was initiated following disclosures from victims, disclosures that set in motion the formal law enforcement process through which the Michigan authorities responsible for investigating crimes of this nature gathered evidence, interviewed victims and witnesses, and constructed the evidentiary foundation necessary to support criminal charges that accurately reflected the full scope and sustained nature of his predatory conduct, a process that required both The careful and sensitive handling of the accounts provided by young victims of sexual abuse and a methodical assembly of the corroborating evidence that would be necessary to support a prosecution capable of achieving conviction and the legal consequences that the gravity of the offenses demanded. Michigan law enforcement authorities conducted the investigation with the seriousness and thoroughness that the nature of the allegations required, working within the framework of Michigan's criminal statutes governing sexual conduct with minors, statutes that provide the legal basis for prosecuting adults in positions of authority who engage in sexual conduct with minor students, and that carry penalties calibrated to reflect the legislature's recognition of the particular gravity of such offenses and the particular vulnerability of the children who are subjected to them. The criminal charges filed against Geisel in Michigan State Court reflected the multiple victims and the sustained nature of the predatory conduct that the investigation had documented. Charges that collectively painted a picture not of an isolated incident of criminal impulsivity, but of a deliberate and sustained pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable young students over a significant period of time, a pattern whose persistence and scope made the question of institutional awareness and response not merely a background consideration, but a central and urgent issue in the community's reckoning with what had happened within its schools. The legal proceedings against Geisel moved through the Michigan state court system in accordance with Michigan criminal procedure, and the evidentiary record assembled during the investigation provided the foundation for a prosecution that sought to hold him fully accountable for the full scope of his criminal conduct, rather than for a subset of his offenses selected for prosecutorial convenience, an approach that reflected prosecutors' determination to ensure that the legal outcome of the case accurately represented the nature and extent of the harm he had caused to the multiple children whose victimization the investigation had documented. Geisel was convicted of the criminal sexual conduct charges brought against him in Michigan State Court, a conviction that represented the formal legal establishment of the criminal character of his conduct and that triggered the sentencing process through which the Michigan court determined the consequences appropriate to the gravity of what he had done, the number of victims affected, the duration of the predatory pattern, and the degree to which he had exploited the institutional authority and the community trust that his position as a teacher had given him access to, and which he had weaponized against the children whose education and welfare he was professionally and ethically obligated to serve. The sentence imposed by the Michigan court reflected the seriousness with which the court viewed the multiple victim, sustained pattern nature of Geisel's offending, imposing a period of incarceration, and the additional legal consequences that Michigan law requires for convicted sex offenders, including registration on the Michigan Sex Offender Registry and the conditions that Michigan law imposes on registered sex offenders to manage the ongoing risk they pose to community safety and to provide law enforcement with the monitoring tools necessary to enforce the restrictions on their activities that their status as convicted sex offenders requires. The Detroit area news outlets that covered the Geisel case provided the local community with a factual account of his crimes, his prosecution, and his sentencing that informed public understanding of what had happened and contributed to the community conversations about institutional responsibility and systemic reform that cases of this nature inevitably and appropriately generate. Conversations that in the Geisel case were particularly urgent given the multiple victim character of the offending and the questions it raised about why the pattern had continued as long as it had before law enforcement became involved. The impact of Geisel's crimes on his victims was profound and lasting, encompassing the full spectrum of psychological and developmental consequences that the research literature on child sexual abuse by institutional authority figures has consistently documented, consequences that are particularly severe in cases involving sustained patterns of abuse over extended periods, because the cumulative weight of repeated victimization by a trusted adult compounds the harm of each individual incident and creates a more deeply entrenched pattern of trauma response that requires more intensive and more sustained therapeutic intervention to address an abuse that is more limited in scope and duration. Each of the students who was victimized by Geisel faced the specific challenges associated with being a victim of teacher sexual abuse, challenges that include the disruption of the educational environment that should be a place of safety and development, the damage to the capacity to trust adult authority figures that is essential to healthy psychological and social development, the particular form of betrayal trauma that results from victimization by someone in whom institutional and community trust has been invested, and the social complications that arise in school communities when a teacher-student abuse case becomes public knowledge and the victims are required to navigate their ongoing educational and social lives in an environment that has been fundamentally altered by the revelation of the abuse. The school or schools in Michigan where Geisel taught were required to undertake the difficult work of institutional examination and reform that the criminal conviction of a faculty member for sustained sexual abuse of multiple students demands. A process that involves not only the immediate steps of cooperating with law enforcement and removing the perpetrator from the classroom, but the more sustained and more difficult work of honestly examining the institutional conditions that allowed the abuse to occur and continue. The supervision practices and reporting culture and organizational dynamics that collectively fail to detect and respond to a pattern of predatory conduct that in retrospect was clearly present and clearly documented in the experiences of multiple victims over multiple years. Michigan's educational policy community engaged with the Geisel case as part of the broader ongoing work of examining and strengthening the state's legal and institutional frameworks for preventing, detecting, and responding to teachers' sexual misconduct. Work that involves not only the adoption of stronger policies and more rigorous enforcement mechanisms, but the cultivation of the kind of institutional culture in schools and school districts that treats the protection of students as a genuine and consistently applied priority rather than a stated value that yields to competing institutional interests when the cost of honoring it becomes socially or organizationally inconvenient. The question of how a teacher can engage in criminal sexual conduct against multiple students over multiple years within a functioning school system without triggering the kind of institutional response that removes him from contact with children and refers the matter to law enforcement is not a question with a comfortable answer, but it is a question that the Geisel case and cases like it demand that educational institutions, policymakers, and communities answer honestly if the systems designed to protect children are to be reformed in ways that make them genuinely capable of fulfilling that protective function, a function that is the most fundamental obligation of any institution entrusted with the care and education of children, and that must be treated as such in the policies, practices, and cultures of every school and school district in the country. The legal record of Timothy Alan Geisel's criminal case in Michigan State Court stands as a permanent and authoritative account of his crimes and their legal consequences, a record that documents both the human cost of sustained predatory conduct by a teacher against the students in his care and the response of the Michigan legal system to that conduct, a response that, while arriving later than the safety of his victims required, at least ultimately provided the formal legal accountability that the gravity of his offenses demanded and that the children he victimized deserved, accountability that the Michigan courts imposed in a manner reflecting the state's commitment to holding adults in positions of institutional authority fully responsible for the criminal exploitation of the children entrusted to their professional care, a commitment that every legal system in every jurisdiction owes to every child whose trust in an adult educator is betrayed in the way that Timothy Alan Geisel betrayed the trust of the students whose victimization his criminal record permanently documents. Number 10. Willard Miller, the Pennsylvania teacher whose crimes against his own students were among the most egregious violations of educational trust ever prosecuted in the federal court system, a case that laid bare the horrifying reality that the most dangerous predators are sometimes the ones standing at the front of the classroom. Willard Miller was a teacher in the state of Pennsylvania whose criminal case occupies a particularly disturbing place in the documented history of teacher sexual misconduct in the United States, not merely because of the nature of the offenses he committed, which were severe enough in themselves to warrant the most serious legal consequences that the American criminal justice system is capable of imposing, but because of the specific category of criminal conduct involved, which went beyond the sexual abuse of students in the physical sense to encompass the production of child sexual abuse material, a category of offense that federal law treats with extraordinary seriousness and that carries mandatory minimum sentences, reflecting the legislature's recognition that the production of such material represents a particularly extreme form of exploitation of children, one that compounds the direct harm of the abuse itself with the additional and permanent harm of creating a visual record of that abuse that can be reproduced and distributed indefinitely, and that subjects the victim to a form of ongoing victimization that persists long after the physical abuse is ended. Miller operated within the Pennsylvania educational system, holding a teaching position that gave him the institutional access to children that his criminal conduct required, access that he exploited in ways that went far beyond what most people, Even those familiar with the landscape of teacher sexual misconduct cases would anticipate or expect, because the production of child sexual abuse material within a school setting represents a level of brazenness and a degree of criminal sophistication that distinguishes cases of this category from the more commonly discussed pattern of teacher-student sexual abuse, requiring not only the predatory motivation and the access to victims that characterize all such cases, but the additional elements of planning, technical capability, and risk tolerance that the production and potential distribution of such material involves. The investigation into Miller's conduct was conducted by federal law enforcement authorities, a jurisdictional choice that reflected the nature of the charges being considered and the federal government's particular authority and expertise in prosecuting crimes involving production and distribution of child sexual abuse material, crimes that are addressed through a comprehensive body of federal law that provides prosecutors with powerful investigative tools and that mandates substantial minimum sentences designed to ensure that the legal consequences for this category of offense are severe enough to reflect both the gravity of the harm caused and the deterrent function that serious sentencing in such cases is intended to serve. Federal investigations of this nature typically involve the coordinated efforts of multiple law enforcement agencies with different areas of expertise, including agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Department of Homeland Security's Homeland Security Investigations Unit, agencies that have developed specialized capabilities for investigating crimes involving the production and distribution of child sexual abuse material, and that bring to such investigations both the technical resources necessary to examine electronic evidence and the investigative experience necessary to build comprehensive cases that accurately reflect the full scope of the criminal conduct involved. The evidence gathered during the federal investigation into Miller's conduct documented a pattern of criminal behavior that prosecutors described as extensive and serious, involving production of child sexual abuse material featuring students. A set of facts that established not merely that Miller had committed the kind of direct sexual abuse of students that characterizes the cases discussed earlier in this account, but that he had gone further, using the access his teaching position provided to produce material that documented that abuse in ways that created an additional layer of criminal liability and an additional dimension of harm to his victims, harm that the federal courts and the federal sentencing guidelines treat with particular seriousness that the permanent and distributable nature of such material demands. The criminal charges filed against Miller in federal court reflected the full scope of the conduct documented during the investigation. Charges under the federal statutes governing the production of child pornography and related offenses, statutes that carry mandatory minimum sentences of 15 years for each count of production, and that can result in aggregate sentences of decades or even life imprisonment when multiple counts are charged and convicted, sentences that reflect the federal legislature's determination that the production of child sexual abuse material is among the most serious categories of offense against children, and that the legal consequences for such production must be severe enough to reflect that determination unambiguously. The federal prosecution of Miller proceeded to the United States District Court for the relevant district in Pennsylvania, with the government presenting the evidence gathered during the investigation in support of the charges filed against him, evidence that the federal prosecutors argued established beyond any reasonable doubt the criminal character of his conduct and the appropriateness of the severe legal consequences that federal law mandated for offenses of this nature and gravity. Miller was convicted on the federal charges brought against him, a conviction that triggered the application of the federal sentencing guidelines applicable to offenses involving production of child sexual abuse material, guidelines that in cases involving multiple counts and the specific aggravating factors present in Miller's case would be expected to result in a sentence of significant length, a sentence measured not in months or a small number of years but in decades, reflecting the cumulative weight of the multiple counts of conviction and the application of the sentencing enhancements that federal law provides for cases involving particularly serious or extensive criminal conduct in this category. The sentence imposed by the federal district court in Miller's case reflected the application of those guidelines to the specific facts established by his conviction, resulting in a period of federal incarceration that represented one of the most severe sentences imposed in a Pennsylvania teacher misconduct case, and that was designed to ensure both that Miller would be incapacitated from any further contact with children for a very long period, and that the sentence served its intended function of communicating the unambiguous message that the production of child sexual abuse material within a school setting is a category of offense that the federal justice system will respond to with the full weight of the legal consequences that Congress has determined are appropriate for conduct of this gravity. The federal prison sentence meant that Miller would be spending a substantial portion of the remainder of his life in federal custody, a practical reality whose significance extends beyond the obvious point about incapacitation to encompass the broader message that the severity of the sentence sends to other potential offenders about the consequences that await those who choose to exploit their professional access to children to produce material documenting the sexual abuse of those children. A deterrent message that the federal sentencing guidelines are specifically designed to communicate, and that cases like Miller's make concrete and tangible in ways that abstract statements about legal consequences cannot. The victims in Miller's case face a distinctive and particularly severe form of ongoing harm that is specific to cases involving production of child sexual abuse material, the knowledge that images or videos documenting their abuse exist in digital form and may be in circulation in ways that they cannot control or monitor, a form of ongoing victimization that the legal and psychological literature on child sexual abuse material has identified as one of the most psychologically damaging aspects of this category of offense, because the permanence and potential reach of digital material means that the harm of the abuse does not end with the physical conduct, but continues in a form that follows the victim indefinitely, surfacing unpredictably in ways that can trigger acute trauma responses even years after the original abuse has ended and the perpetrator has been convicted and imprisoned. Federal law provides victims of child sexual abuse material production with the right to seek restitution from their perpetrators for the ongoing harm caused by the existence and potential distribution of material documenting their abuse. A legal mechanism that acknowledges the distinctive nature of this category of harm and attempts to provide at least some measure of financial recognition of the ongoing costs that victims bear as a consequence of having been victimized in this way. Though legal scholars and victim advocates have consistently noted the practical limitations of restitution as a remedy for a form of harm that is by its nature not fully compensable by any financial payment. The Pennsylvania educational community and the federal law enforcement community both engaged seriously with the Miller case as an illustration of the need for robust and effectively enforced legal frameworks for addressing the most serious categories of teacher misconduct, frameworks that provide law enforcement with the investigative tools necessary to detect and document crimes that perpetrators go to considerable lengths to conceal, that provide prosecutors with the legal authority and the mandatory sentencing provisions necessary to ensure that convictions result in consequences proportionate to the gravity of the offenses, and that provide victims with the legal recognition and the practical support necessary to address the full scope of the harm they have suffered. The school district in Pennsylvania, where Miller taught, was required to undertake the institutional examination and reform process that the criminal conviction of a teacher for offenses of the severity and this category necessarily demands, a process that involved not only cooperation with the federal investigation and the immediate removal of Miller from any contact with students, but the more sustained work of examining the institutional conditions, the supervisory practices, and the organizational culture that had allowed a teacher to engage in production of child sexual abuse material involving students without being detected and stopped by the institutional mechanisms that are supposed to protect children from exactly this kind of exploitation. The question of how such conduct can occur within a functioning school system without triggering institutional detection and response is one that the Miller case shares with many of the other cases discussed in this account, and the answer in each instance involves some combination of the same factors: insufficient supervision, inadequate reporting culture, the tendency to extend excessive benefit of the doubt to faculty members whose professional conduct appears satisfactory by the surface, measures that institutional evaluation processes typically employ, and the organizational dynamics that make it genuinely difficult for children and colleagues to raise concerns about conduct that departs from professional and legal norms in ways that are deliberately concealed by the perpetrator and that may be visible only to those with direct knowledge of what is occurring. Pennsylvania's legal and educational policy communities engage with the Miller case as part of the ongoing work of examining and strengthening the state's frameworks for preventing, detecting, and responding to teachers' sexual misconduct, work that is part of a broader national effort to develop the legal, institutional, and cultural conditions necessary to protect children from predatory adults who exploit professional positions to gain access to vulnerable young people an effort whose urgency is reinforced by every case that demonstrates the devastating human cost of institutional failure and capacity of determined predators to operate within school systems for extended periods when conditions that should prevent such conduct are absent or inadequate. The federal court record of Willard Miller's case constitutes the authoritative legal account of offenses and their consequences, a record that documents both the extraordinary gravity of what he did to the children in his care and the response of the federal justice system to that conduct, a response that in this instance was severe enough and comprehensive enough to represent a genuine and meaningful reckoning with the full scope of the criminal conduct involved, a reckoning that, while it could not undo the harm done to the children whose abuse he had documented and whose victimization he had made permanent in the most disturbing way imaginable, at least ensure that the legal consequences he faced were proportionate to the gravity of what he had done, and that the federal prison sentence he received communicated unambiguously the message that the American legal system reserves its most severe responses for those who commit the most serious violations of the trust that society places in the adults entrusted with the care and education of its children, a trust that Willard Miller violated in a manner as complete and as consequential as any document in the long and troubling history of teachers' sexual misconduct in the United States.